Africa leaders have converged on Addis Ababa, the headquarters of African Union, to reflect on the continent's relationship with a strategically changing world, as well as take a position on current developments, including China's increasing incursion into the socio-economic and political fabrics of Africa, the Russia-Ukraine war, and efforts by the West to retain its prime position in African affairs. Joining us now to have a conversation about all these are African affairs analyst Achike Chude, Arise analyst Dr. Sam Amadi, Temitope Olodo, who is a security analyst. Gentlemen, welcome to this panel discussion, as it were. All right, I'm going to start with Achike, who is here with us in the Lagos studios. Now, okay, they're gathering in Addis Ababa amid all these concerns of external influence. So do you think China and Russia is shaping Africa's agenda? And are we in an era of new colonialism being touted for years now?
Yeah, well, one thing I know is that we are in an unprecedented situation where so many other powers have increasingly shown interest in Africa. And of course, we know that we used to have a bipolar world that eventually became unipolar as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, you can't even talk about a bipolar world anymore. You talk about a multipolar world where countries like the United States are still wielding influence. Of course, Russia has its own level of influence, and China most especially. But in between are other powers also trying to play roles in the African continent. We have countries that had hitherto not shown any interest in Africa before now because it was not of to their strategic interest. Countries like Israel before this Israel and the Palestinian crisis began to show interest, and then you have the Saudis, and other countries too. Then the French, the Turkish government, some of them trying to organize summits between those countries and then African political leaders. So obviously there is a newfound love for Africa, love in quotes. Don't forget that at a time suddenly America and Europe no longer saw Africa as very viable. And then when they began to look away from fossil fuel and all that, and then Africa no longer had that kind of attraction that she used to have, that created an opportunity for the Chinese to move into the African continent and to dominate the political space in Africa. And so it is very difficult, for instance, for any of the countries, including the United States, to remove China or to withhold China's influence in the continent, because China has, that's the thinking of African political leaders, has a better relationship with African leaders. They do not interfere with Africa's political crisis. They ask no questions. They just come in there, do whatever they want to do. If it's to put infrastructure on ground, they do that. But people have often complained about the relationship that they have with African countries, and they have signaled the fact that it could be very dangerous, where you have a situation where some of these countries are end up owning China, and then China goes ahead to take over some of their vital national assets. So this is something that has elicited some forms of nationalism in those other countries. As for Russia, we should not forget that Russia has always been involved in Africa, especially after the post-independence era, when the Cold War was at its peak. Russia pitched tent with a lot of African countries, especially Southern Africa, when the battle to decolonize, not just decolonization, but against apartheid was at its zenith. And that's why you see a lot of countries also being sympathetic to Russia. But then the problem is, what kind of a relationship do African countries want to have with this other entrance into the African region? Because the good thing about it is that Africa, you can say that Africa is the beautiful bride, and when you have a bride that is exceedingly very beautiful, then the bride finds herself in a position to make choices and gives conditions. I don't know how wise Africa is, because with everybody coming, obviously not for love of Africa essentially, but love of the resources that Africa has, that is now increasingly much more important in the world. You're talking about electric, vehicles and EV batteries and the rest, all the components for, laptops, telephones, and the rest. There's increasing need of those, resources, and a lot of these resources can be found in the continent. But it is how Africa engages, how Africa succeeds in playing one against the other for the purpose of benefiting from it. That is where, we begin to ask the question. You've had some international statesmen, for instance, Otto von Bismarck of Germany had a way of playing one against the other. But the continent of Africa, really, do we have that unanimity of purpose, of vision, right, to be able to even act as one? There's so much disparity within the African continent, so much conflicts going on, which the AU meeting is supposed to address. Without unity, without forming consensus, agreeing to work together and to have a common objective, it becomes very difficult, if not practically impossible, to be able to play the kind of diplomacy that is needed to attract greater benefit from Africa in her engagement with the rest of the world.
Thank you very much, Achike. We're just going to pause on that. And I want to come to you, Mr. Temitope Olodo. Now, we are looking at this Wagner-Russia influence that we're seeing in Burkina Faso, Mali, and other parts of Africa. Now, given Nigeria's proximity to border with its West African neighbors and the poorest West African borders, there's a vulnerability to infiltrating groups such as Wagner. Now, is Nigeria next? Is there a justification for this concern? As a security analyst yourself, what do you have to say about this?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm not really bothered about concern that Nigeria could be next. There's no doubt in my mind that we have the intelligence, we have the people to make sure that that foreign intervention does not happen. However, there are concerns that when you have private security companies, backed by Russia, playing a critical role in the northern axis of Nigeria, there are some concerns. Number one, it will draw unnecessary attraction from all those jihadists, if I could use those Islamic jihadists in the Sahel, who might be interested in, they don't like foreign boots on ground. So they will be more or less concentrating in that area, and that will be a call for arms for many of their brothers, to come from all across the world to that particular area. So we don't want that increase. But we also know that when you use private military arms, there is that human rights challenges that could be associated with it, and lack of accountability is an issue there. So those are the issues of concern for me, and the fact that if there is a problem there, it will definitely affect our border, as we've seen that it has affected our border. We could see even with the issue with Niger that we have recent issue with ECOWAS. We know that part of the reason why we could not take those strategic decisions that we needed to take with regard to Niger was because of our closeness to that border or to that country, and the influence of Russia in that particular area. So there's no doubt in my mind that it is an issue of concern. But whether Nigeria will become next now, there's no doubt in my mind that we will not be affected by such challenges there. But of course, we need to be concerned, and as a security analyst, I would say the Nigerian government and people involved in the security arrangements need to at least keep that in their radar.
All right, we still have Dr. Sam Amadi, still on to give us his perspective on this, still on security and specific to Nigeria. What do you think the country should be doing to avoid falling into the same shoes as Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger? And just to add to that, do you think, just how potent is Wagner since the death of Prigozhin, the founder, recently on the continent, you think?
Well, first, let's say that Nigeria's obligation should be to properly appraise the risk. Risks are things that mutate and they change. So if you look at the way the world is going with the fragmentation, with the relaunch of ideology and interests, and the Wagner Group and all these other executive services are part of the lawlessness of international politics. So they exist as hitmen, as doing services, maybe at the behest of Russia. Of course, the death of the leader presupposes some weakness, but we know that they have strong position and they're coming back. What should we do? I think the first thing is to first let's appraise our security and intelligence architecture. Oftentimes we assume that we have a good intelligence. I had worked in the foreign affairs. I do know we have those structure, but are they efficient in picking information? Again, with Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger pulling out of ECOWAS, further reducing our leverage, with a very conflicting relationship between Nigeria and these countries now because of the stance of the Shiwaji government, we are also at a weaker position to preempt. And like the former he said, you are having to deal with three things here. You are dealing with porous border, you are dealing with some understandable weakening of our intelligence and defense capability. You're also dealing with degraded diplomatic, leverage. And furthermore, you're going to have to, this Wagner group intertwined with communities. So they probably be working with insiders in those governments. And depending on how the global polity shifts and how Nigeria plays the game between the West and Russia, we might see that Nigeria could become a target for those kind of the dangerous maneuvering. So we just have to be alert. We need to reconsider our border policy across the Sahel and the Gulf of Guinea. We need to also, as a matter of fact, begin to build internal competencies and begin to educate our population in the northern part of the country to understand the risk, to have the early warning signals and to have red flags and have actionable intelligence that can be used. So we don't just assume that the conventional intelligence agencies are picking intelligence. We need to use the people, prime them up to really challenge. So ultimately, we're going to see that the global policy has shifted, and as it shifts, our job is to understand the ideological changes, the interests at play, and prepare ourselves to be able to engage. The worst is that Africa doesn't have a developmental policy, ideology. Africa doesn't have a uniform interest, and therefore we don't have the level of resistance we had during the time of colonialism and immediately post-colonialism. We had negritude, had Pan-Africanism, had Marxist Africanist socialism. These ideological buffers help us to create ideological resistance. And here today, we're actually more despondent, weak government, disconnected citizens, and a degradation of civic consciousness. I think it's a bad time for us to be facing that threat.
Okay, I'd like to bring it back into the studio because, we have laid this context, but we're still continuing to see a lot of African states, while struggling under the global economic situations, are still turning more and more to Russia. So is it that for some reason, Russia, regardless of what's happening, is still a significant player in Africa for the long haul? Now, this is directed at you.
Yeah, well, Russia has been making incursion into the African continent for a long time now, for quite some time, at least from 2014. They began to make a more serious incursion through the Wagner Group. And you talked about the Wagner Group. They have been involved in quelling some conflicts in the African continent and creating some conflicts here and there too. It's a mercenary organization that also has motivated by the need to make money, business. So it's a business also, their activities in Africa. And so while Russia is not putting troops on ground directly, because for instance, of course, the Wagner Group is a private military organization, and private military organizations are banned in Russia, but not beyond Russia. So the Russian government has been able to use them to get some foothold in the African continent. Countries. They have been involved in Teodora, helping the government of Teodora when they had insurrection activities by non-state actors. And they have also been involved increasingly in French-speaking West African countries. They're even in Cameroon also. They also have signing some agreements here and there. So those ones have been around for quite some time. And so you see some of these African countries who have not had a very good deal in terms of their engagement with their former colonial overlords. For instance, the crisis that France has been having, and that of France has been most notable because France's policy of assimilation then over time created a lot of things, and then what the stranglehold they have on some of these African countries have been very inimical to the progress of these countries, and over time we have seen this matter come to the fore. most of the coups that are taking place, if not all, are in French-speaking West Africa. So there is a connection somewhere, and then in comes the Russians, because there's a saying, an old African saying, that where a tree once stood, another one will stand in its place. So they've gotten some of these forces out of their countries, like in Mali and others. Now, Burkina Faso, what else is going to replace it? And so they are looking forward towards Russia. Russia has not had a history of creating problems in Africa generally, unlike the colonial overlords. So there's a move towards Russia, but in a way that could be inimical, depending on how it is handled.
Very good. Temitope Olodo is still with us in London. Vladimir Putin is isolated on the international stage at the moment. His travels are also limited, as it were. So how much risk is there doing business with him, both from an economic and, of course, a security perspective?
For we in Africa, 1.2 billion individual citizens, I think what is important for all is anyone that could help us to maintain economic stability, security, safety for our people. And my colleagues have said it all. One of the challenges we had with the West is that they put a lot of hurdles in front of us when it comes to securing the equipment that we need to fight this war. And history is there, to prove that in some situations, some of these Western countries were even responsible for some of the security challenges that we are grappling with at the moment. Russia does not have that baggage, and that's the reason why most of the African countries are quick to run to Russia, where there is no restriction to the amount of equipment that we want to fight the war that we want. The only challenge we have is that when the Chinese bring their weapons with their language and they have to train us to use it, and then you have the Russians bring theirs, the Filipinos bring theirs, the Japanese bring that. How do we have a streamline of equipment that everybody in the military and the security services can use effectively? That's the challenge that we're confronted with. But the politics that is ongoing, of course, is of concern to us, because we could see what is happening in Ukraine. You will see the stance that Africa took when it comes to Ukraine. Even with Israel, the stance that we took, it shows that we wouldn't have taken those stance 10 or 15 years ago, when certain countries were the ones dictating, the kind of investment and opportunities that are out there for us. But I think, just like my colleagues have highly mentioned earlier, what we need is continental connectivity now, because even within Africa, our trading within Africa alone, if done properly, is enough to sustain us. Our cooperation within Africa alone, because we saw it during the Jonathan era, when the other bordering countries were helping us to deal with the issue of Boko Haram. We could see that we're able to box them in at that particular time with a lot of help from other countries. So it means that even the security challenges that we're talking about, if we could get support from other African countries, we're more likely to be able to address them even better. And I'm hoping that even with the issue of the state policing that we're talking about, there's some countries in Africa that have very good intelligence records, like Morocco, like countries like Botswana, when it comes to policing. So there are things that we could learn within Africa. We don't need to go to the West or any of these other countries, because we can do it the African way and achieve the result that we want in an African way.
All right then, thank you so much for that. And we're going to be switching gears a bit, coming to you, Mr. Amadi, to move on from Russia to China. Now, a lot of people have critiqued this partnership with China, even referred to it as dining with the tiger. While China appears to be actively involved in the continent's agricultural sector, a deep dive shows that the relationship, although the relationship greatly favors China, they have the resources, they have the global influence to offer a give and take scenario. However, it's more evident that there is much more take when it comes to their relationship with the African continent. Is it too late to turn this around, or are we in too deep?
Well, first, China has been very strategic. Unlike Unlike Russia and the US, China has not been an imperial power outside, the former imperial China, after which China burnt the ship. China was the first to go around the world, got as far as Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, and at a point, the leader of China burnt everything, made it a crime. And so China became insular. And so they still have that insularity. But the key thing here is China seems to be more interested in economic growth, expansion. And they need to expand to Africa. They see the raw materials. They're also becoming a high-tech country, so their competitive advantage in labor cost is getting lower and lower. So they need new markets. Now, what has happened is that many people feel that the Chinese deal, in economic sense, imposes a hardship, debt. They are tying African economies, so what happened with Angola and others, with some maybe high debts. And the West also feel jealous and also, interpreting Chinese economic foray in Africa as is second enslavement. But essentially, I think it could be win-win. Look, we should see China as strategic in two ways. First, I see the Chinese model of economic growth as more commendable. And the neoliberal market base doesn't work, has never worked. China borrowed from Korea, from Japan. Japanese borrowed from Hamilton, US, as Secretary of State. They borrowed from Germany with Friedrich List and others, and that was the same part that the Industrial Revolution took. So we can actually see China the East Asians as what we can copy, emulate China in that sense. Secondly, we can see China as our go-to in terms of low tech. If we're going to take industrialization seriously, we have to think around first starting with imitation, and China provides a much more relatable technology. So I think that the relationship with China could be a good one. What is missing really, that African leaders, unlike Chinese leaders, have not developed, Nigerian leaders too, a strategic national development agenda and create political ownership and consensus. And therefore, you engage China from a strategic perspective of what we gain as a country, not what businessmen who are posing as leaders can get. So if you look at the deals we do with China, they lack that sense of a defensive sense of trying to put the economy in the short, medium term and long term, and more about, okay, China gives us the money, we waste that money, and then China gets back on us with debts that we have to pay and maybe put a lien on those assets and therefore double loss. So if we reform ourselves and get leadership that has a development agenda and focus like Chinese leader, then China could be a good partner to deal with. So I don't want us to fall into the Western blackmail. I say, okay, fine. If China comes with cheaper credit, better, more relatable technology, a good proposal, we should take it on. But we should take it as the way the China would have taken when they brought the GEs, when they brought ThinkPad, and then use Lenovo. We should be strategic and take China in, use China, leverage on China, and build strong industrial base. Not go to China, raise fund, and use it, dissipate it, share it, loot it, and then China takes a lien on the asset, and that's the dangerous area.
Very good, Dr. Amadi. Now, Achike, how can we, as a continent, leverage on our resources and expertise to create a relationship that are equally beneficial to ourselves? In 30 seconds, please.
Yeah, I think there's one aspect we forget that has been responsible for the morass in the continent, and that is the issue of effective governance. Where part of the discussion today at the AU is the issue of instability, violence, coups and all of that, and it's brought about by bad governance. I think it's one area to concentrate on, really, to have the right kind of political leadership that is responsible and responsive to the needs of Africa, that has a vision for Africa, and is willing to make effective sacrifice for the continent. And once you have that, then every other thing, will come into play. So I think that it's important you recognize the fact that you're a well-resourced continent and use these resources, for leverage. Ensure that you have some level of stability within the continent itself, so that having done that, you can actually begin the process of engaging the rest of the world with unanimity of purpose, across the different political leadership in the continent. We need to achieve unity of purpose and a vision, and then leverage the resources that we have, not just natural but human resources, which of course in the next 25 years, 25% of the world's youthful population will come from Africa. If we can get political leadership right in Africa, Africa will dominate the world as a result of that.
Definitely. I agree. I think that's a good place to end it today. We appreciate your time and analysis. From London, Temitope Olodo, security analyst. We have Dr. Sam Amadi in Abuja, and with us in the studio, of course, Achike Chude, African Affairs analyst. We appreciate your time and analysis on Newsday.